we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Iowa Files. I'm Gail Brubaker. I'm the Executive Director of the West Des Moines Historical Society, blah, blah, blah. The Iowa Files is in partnership with the West Des Moines Library, who we hugely appreciate. It is live streamed thanks to EMC Insurance, so thank you to them as well. And this month we have a really, I think, striking story, or at least someone's told me it's absolutely amazing. Kate Levasseur is a friend. She's a board member, so technically she's my boss, so be nice to her. She's a self-described history fanatic, researching not just her own family's history, but the occasionally weird and wonderful stories that make Iowa an interesting place to be. In her day job, she's the archivist at the World Food Prize, so she is steeped in history. So thank you so much, Kate, for coming and talking today.
Thanks, Gail. Well, I wanted to say thank you, everyone, for braving the snow, some of the snow that we got last night. But one thing that is really special to me about the story that I'm telling today is that it's just mind-blowing when I just came across it looking through the annals of Iowa. I was doing a search on Iowa murders, which is a little dark to begin with, but this is a story that I had never heard of before. And for as much as every other podcast these days seems to be about true crime, finding some sort of niche in that market, the fact that this is relatively unknown is pretty big in my mind. And usually I like to focus my history and my research on kind of genealogy, cemeteries, women and children. It's just really hard not to focus on a murder arson investigation that goes across state lines, hits on the Klondike Gold Rush. There's just a little bit of everything for everybody in this story, so I'm really excited to be able to share it with you today. As you can see, the title is State versus Novak, so that's kind of a shorthand for the legal case that eventually came of this manhunt across international boundaries, as Gail pointed out in a graphic for this that was shared on Facebook this morning. So it really is more than just the murder itself. It's also about a precedent-setting look at circumstantial evidence being used to convict people in a court of law, and also forensic evidence. So this is an early case that used dental records and evidence like that to help show that a person was guilty, or in some cases, like in this case, was not who perhaps everyone thought they would be. So we'll start with the crime. So the fire on the night of February 2nd through 3rd, so it's overnight between those two. In 1897, we have a fire break out in the town of Walford, Iowa, which is close to kind of Cedar Rapids area for those that are familiar. And overnight, the general store in town burns to the ground. The whole town is there trying to help put out the fire, and there's concern because they know that one of the owners of the store, Frank Novak, has been sleeping in the general store overnight to help ward off attempts by burglars. There have been several burglary attempts in the building lately. So the thought is, if someone's sleeping in the building, then the burglars will not come. So as they're sifting through the rubble, the townsfolk, that is, they come across a bone, which then leads to the discovery of a torso and a skull. And at this point, they are trying to determine if it's foul play or if it was just the body, so there was a death just as a result of the building catching on fire. So everyone assumes it's Frank Novak. They knew he was in the building, but then everyone's shocked when another family comes forward and says, we haven't seen our son, our brother, Ed Murray. And the more they start talking to people around town, it's known that Ed Murray and Frank Novak had been seen at the saloon together the previous night, having a drink. And while they weren't known to be particular friends, they knew each other. So everyone's kind of synthesizing this information, but there's still a general thought that the remains in the store are Frank Novak. There had been recent break-in attempts, as I mentioned, and in addition to the general store burning down, Frank had built kind of a side building. It wasn't a full building, but it was a kind of a alcove addition of the building to be used as a bank. There wasn't a bank in town, but Frank Novak, since it was a large general store, had started holding money for people that didn't want to drive all the way into Cedar Rapids or take the train into Cedar Rapids. So this was where the safe was and kind of became known as the bank in town. And that image on the right there is the smoldering remains of the Walford General Store. We'll put a little drama. And as I said here, so they find, in addition to the physical remains, they find 4 items that help lead them to the conclusion that this body is Frank Novak. Some pocket scissors and a penknife that are known to belong to Frank Novak. An ID tag, that one's a little more obvious, and a piece of dental bridge work is found under the skull. So everyone says, with all these 4 clues, it's got to be Frank. But is it? Almost immediately, so the next day, February 4th, the Benton County attorney, who's an up-and-coming legal star, MJ Tobin, decides to hold the coroner's inquest so they can make some determinations because both Novak and Murray's families are claiming the body. So in addition to these 4 pieces of evidence previously mentioned, Ed Murray's sister comes forward and says, the reason why I think this is my brother is I recognize scraps of fabric that were found on the body, like in the armpits around the back. It's a shirt that I purchased for him with a very distinctive pattern on the fabric. There are also remains around the waist of a St. Joseph's belt, which is something that he received from his sisters. They were Catholic. It was worn as a reminder for chastity. And it was well known amongst his family and other people in town that he wore this belt almost all the time. So there was fabric around his waist, too, that led his sister and his family to believe that these were the remains of Ed Murray. Interestingly, in addition to friends and family, people that would have witnessed the two together, they also called in a dental assistant from Cedar Rapids named Louis Hassick. He was 18 years old, but he had been working with these dentists in Cedar Rapids for about 4 years, and he would do dental exams when a dentist was busy. So he had a lot of experience for an 18-year-old who wasn't a licensed dentist. And he had recently been in Walford and visited and examined Frank Novak. And there was a very particular tooth loss that Frank Novak had, but Ed Murray also had some missing teeth as well. So Louis looked at the records and the skull itself and said, this doesn't match what I would expect to see in a skull of Frank Novak. And in addition to perhaps teeth having fallen out or gotten smashed, gotten damaged in the fire, there's no way this bridge work would fit into the jaw of this skull. So this is just an inquest. It's not a trial or any sort of determination, but this is a big deal. They're looking at this evidence, this physical evidence, and they're matching it and saying this cannot be Frank Novak based on the testimony of this 18-year-old dental assistant. So with this and the other information regarding the fabric, it's determined that the body found in the general store ruins is that of Ed Murray. The body is turned over to his family for burial. It has to be exhumed a few days later because they decide that they want to save part of the skull as well as the stomach contents, or the stomach itself. They want to send it to the laboratory in case there was some sort of poisoning or foul play. They want to save that evidence for trial. And it was determined that there was damage to the skull. There was also blood pooled underneath that. So that said foul play to the doctor at this inquest. So they have to determine whether that damage was, if it was foul play, if the damage occurred after death or if it occurred before death as a way to incapacitate Murray before the fire in case of a murder investigation. So at this point, Novak is still missing. No one's seen him, but his family's still saying, it's him, he's the one that died, or something bad has happened to him too. He's also a victim in this situation. But you start reading the newspapers, the hunt is on. Frank Novak is now considered a murderer, and he is at large. This is still the week of the fire. I'm going to try to remind you of dates just because it's kind of a fast-paced at sometimes, and sometimes we're going to be jumping back and forth to when the action actually happened versus when the detectives find out about it. So if there's ever any confusion, I'll try to keep track of both timelines as well as possible. So of course, now that Frank is a suspect, we're going to start digging in to his motive. What could it be? It all comes down to money. While on the surface, Frank Novak was a pillar of the community, he had this store that was clean and provided people with anything that they could possibly want in this small town if they didn't feel like going into Cedar Rapids. He was a pretty fancy guy. He was noticed he had a diamond ring. He was always wearing fancy clothes. So he had this lavish lifestyle, but he was also a compulsive gambler, as it turned out. And it wasn't just, a poker table. He was also investing heavily in grain markets in Chicago. He felt he was a pretty savvy investor, but his investments may not have bore that out. So it was estimated by those that were starting to look into it that he probably owed about $20,000. And some of that would be to people in town. He basically had hit everyone in town up for money. So he probably owed about $3,500 just to people in town, friends, family. So he had quite a bit of debt. And the bank in Cedar Rapids said he has $66 in his bank account. We're not letting him draw any of it, anything over that $66 because we don't feel like we're going to get it back. And he had told the bank he was sending an envelope with $500 to be deposited from the store. The envelope arrived at the bank empty. His associate said, it was just an accident. There's a lot going on. The people have been trying to break into the store. But that was still a big question mark for a lot of people. And it had been about 2 years. And there had been a lot of other odd incidents. His store had actually burned down earlier. His current partner was a brother-in-law. And previously, he had also had the general store operating with a brother-in-law. That brother-in-law had fallen off of a train coming back from Chicago, and the store had burned to the ground. So he collected about $7,000 worth of insurance money at that point in time, too. So people weren't really willing to say he murdered his brother-in-law yet or that he burned the store down the first time for insurance money, but people were starting to maybe have a bit of a more critical examination of some of these past events. But then there were the life insurance policies. So there were 5 from 5 different companies, and also Frank was a part-time insurance agent himself. And one of the larger policies was with Travelers Insurance Company, which we kind of think of in Des Moines because of the umbrella light downtown. But at this point, so out of St. Louis, $10,000 was with Travelers. And so several had been taken out recently. In fact, one insurance agent said, I was actually supposed to write him another $5,000 policy this very week. That didn't happen. His friends just said, no, this isn't anything suspicious. If anything, he's just overinsured. That's it. That's the only thing he's guilty of. So were it his body, had he perished in this fire, his wife would inherit about $27,000 worth of insurance payouts. So his debts could be settled. And almost immediately, his cousin Joe, who is a lawyer, kind of a shady lawyer, but aggressive, immediately started filing to get those lawsuits to pay out. And all of the insurance companies said, no, I don't think we'll be doing that right now. So they declared that they are going to contest payment of these policies. And Travelers Insurance, in particular, as a large policyholder, says, we're going to send someone to check this out. We're going to hire an investigator. They write to the other 4 companies and say, if anyone wants to chip in to this investigation, we would like that, but no one else responded. One company said they'd throw in $250, but most of these other companies said, well, if he's alive, which we think he is, then we don't have to pay out, so why should we be paying money for this investigation? So they hire a detective agency, if Travelers does, to track him down. And it was started by a man named Gus Teal. He was the president, and he had been a spy during the Civil War. He had been a Pinkerton, so he had a very romantic history in the detecting arena. And he sends out of St. Louis, he's in communication with their New York office, and they start sending investigators to Iowa to see exactly what is going on. The pursuit. So the detectives, about 5, end up in Iowa, and they start chasing down leads. And it is determined that a man matching Frank's description had been seen walking around in hunting clothes, like a hunting outfit, with a shotgun, which people figured would be a pretty good way to escape detection. If you see someone walking around in a field wearing a hunting outfit with a shotgun, you're not necessarily going to assume he's an escaped murderer that's trying to hide from you. It later came out talking to witnesses that he had stopped at a farmhouse on the way to Iowa City and asked for breakfast, stayed with the family for a little while, was absolutely charming. They loved him. And then he stops at a hotel, pays $20 for basically a ride into Iowa City, and then he buys a train ticket to get to Omaha. So this is just overnight. So at this point in time, if we're going back to the timeline, he buys this, makes it to Iowa City and buys a ticket basically the day after the fire. So everyone else is cleaning up his store and finding the human remains, and he's hopping on a train to Omaha. He does go under a false name, but it's not a very good false name because he signs the register as Frank Alfred, and Alfred is his middle name. So perhaps not the sneakiest of aliases. But he heads to Omaha, and that's where they pick him up. And so they look at all the different ticket buyers, the ticket brokers, and it turns out he's memorable because even though he's in hunting clothes and has a shotgun, he doesn't have any, like a case for the gun, there's no sort of other luggage. It's just a man buying a ticket in a hunting outfit with a shotgun. So he purchased a ticket. This is the other reason they remember him. He purchased a ticket from Omaha to Portland and Vancouver. So that was a pretty long train ride. Not many people were buying that ticket. And he also purchased an add-on to Juneau, Alaska. Well, that's quite a trip. So his handwriting matched. They checked the letter that he had written and the Frank Alfred signature in the register. They matched the handwriting, and so the chase was on. So they head across. They knew from talking to other people that he had been very interested in different cities in California. So they actually sent some investigators to California to check out and see if they could pick up his trail. They end up in Portland, and they find out in Portland that he had sold the Portland to Vancouver part of the ticket. So as far as they knew, he was still in Portland. But then they didn't have luck in Portland, so they ended up going to Seattle as the next major city. And on March 31st, they pick up the trail. They basically were walking around, checking out all of the seedier parts of Seattle, inexpensive hotels, bars, and they find out that the Alki, so a steamer out of Seattle, had departed February 23rd, and a man matching Frank Novak's description had been on it. So they ended up talking to a Chinese gambler named Lu Gong, according to the story. So he had spent a lot of time on this ship ride with Frank, gambling, smoking, tobacco. At that point, he was playing pretty low stakes. He had run out of money, or he was running low on funds. So he actually ended up having to pawn that precious diamond ring to get more money. But whenever you talk to people about Frank Novak, it was interesting. Multiple detectives said everyone said he was really good at holding his liquor and could smoke more tobacco than anyone thought was healthy for him. So the newspapers reported this. It was still the end of the Victorian era, but the morality police are on full patrol. So they're going to make sure everyone in the newspaper knows that he drinks a lot and he's smoking a lot because he is a shady character. So by March 4th, so we're almost exactly a month out from the fire, we know the ship landed in Juneau, so he's made it to Alaska. So at this point, the detective agency says, yeah, this investigation has been going really great. They had their agent on the West Coast ready to go. But then, after some thinking, if he's in Juneau, he's probably not going to stay in Juneau. He's headed for the gold fields. He's heading into the interior of Alaska where he can lose, everyone will lose track of him and he can start a new identity. And you needed a special kind of investigator to head into the wilds of the Yukon. So Thiel calls back his team and selects a new investigator to pick up the trail. Red Perrin was his name. And Red Perrin was, if you read about him, you'd think he was entirely made up out of bad detective fiction from the late 1800s, early 1900s. He had come to the attention of the agency. He had been hired because he spent a lot of time in the Southwest. Some stories said he was a deputy, some said he was a marshal, some said he just liked finding trouble but stayed on the right side of it so he wouldn't land in jail. But he had recently, for the agency, tracked down another Iowa criminal, Larrabee, who's the nephew of one of Iowa's governors who had embezzled quite a bit of money from his employer. And that chase took him 1,500 miles into Mexico. So he said, okay, he's got a track record for tracking criminals down in far-flung locales. Let's bring him on. So at this point, it's the end of March, beginning of April. So it's been about a month and a half, almost 2 months. So there's this pretty significant head start. So who knows where he is? They know that he's been in Juneau, and that's about what they know. So just to give a little context for Alaska in this time period, it's just kind of it's not a total coincidence. There's a reason he went to Alaska, but the fact that this story gets to touch on what is happening with the Klondike Gold Rush is actually pretty fascinating. So just in case you all aren't as familiar with the map of Alaska in your mind as I was not. So we have Juneau is right here towards the bottom. This says British America, so that's Canada. And right here, for those of you that are familiar, then we have, kind of over the Aleutian headed that way. And so where they think he's going to be headed is up here to this big red blob, which is the gold fields of Dawson City. So that's kind of where they think he's going to be headed. But as you can see, that's pretty high in the interior, and actually, it's in Canada. So Juneau, prior to the gold rush, had just been a teeny tiny little hardly anyone was there. Sitka had been a Russian outpost, so a lot of the bigger cities in Alaska at this time had some connection to Russia, or being founded or established by Russia. But Juneau had really started to boom as kind of a base camp for those that are trying to get into the interior of Alaska for this Klondike Gold Rush. So in Juneau, Perrin meets the agent that is kind of keeping an eye on things in Juneau, and they discover that he had stayed for Frank Novak had stayed for some time in Juneau, more gambling, trying to recoup some of that loss, and also to find a kind of a crew that he can hang out with, that he can sail with up to Dawson City. They said he pawned his ring here in Juneau, but they were not able to find any evidence of what happened to his diamond ring. But they did find out that he had picked up a new and perhaps better alias, J.A. Smith. So he wasn't just going with the first name, middle name alias anymore. Now, the big thing here, the administrative work is always very important to get in line before you're going to go arrest people in, again, far-flung locales. So when he arrived in Juneau, Perrin held papers both from Iowa, signed by the governor, to extradite him back to Iowa. There were papers signed by President McKinley, so warrants of receipt. So the U.S. government had to authorize him to do this on a federal level. And since, as I mentioned, the Dawson City, those gold fields stretched into Canada, they went, oh, now that we know that this is a possibility, we're actually going to have to get papers from the Canadian government in case he's in Canada when we need to arrest him. Now, of course, today, that seems inconvenient, but we can handle it. He had to take a boat back down to Vancouver, where he went on a train all the way to Ottawa, got the papers, got on the train and went back to Vancouver. So he doesn't get back to the west coast of Canada until May 20th. Okay, so remember, he kind of hopped on the boat up to Juneau on April 4th, Perrin did. So it is almost another 2 months that he's lost just getting all the paperwork in order in case he happens to find him and can arrest him. So he actually also has to meet the governor in Sitka, so he has one more stop even after going to Canada, going to Ottawa, and that's specifically to get things in order for the Yukon territory itself. So he's got Iowa, he's got the United States federal government, he's got the Canadian federal government, and he's got the territorial government for the Yukon. So all the paperwork is in order. And this just is for context. This is a picture of the Golden Stairs. So this is part of the Chilkoot Trail. So Red Perrin did not take, he wasn't taking his iPhone to log images of his journey. But when I saw this picture, you think of kind of the Klondike. There's no one there, isolated. You're kind of by yourself doing your thing. But this is an image of people getting ready to go on the Klondike. There's kind of a town set up at the bottom of this pass. They're just shoving supplies on people and just one by one in a line going up this pass to head on their way into the interior. And this is 1898, so it is a little after the events of our tale, but it's close enough that it gives you at least an idea of just how many people were traveling to try to find their golden future in the Klondike. So now to hop back into our story specifically, we're going to talk about the journey to Dawson City. Now, I highly recommend, I have a book about this topic that I'll give you the information for at the end. I highly recommend if you're interested in what this journey would have been like, it will go into much more detail for you than I can provide during this presentation because I want to make sure we talk about the court case as well. But just to give you some ideas, when he had been in Washington, D.C., he had met a Norwegian, whose last name is Knudsen, who is a carpenter, and one of his jobs was to help transport criminals, basically, from Alaska. And what do you know, Perrin found Knudsen was back up in Alaska. And so not only was his background with the law beneficial, but also you have to build your own boat to go up the Yukon River. So having a carpenter is a good friend to have in this particular journey. So he decides he and Knudsen are going to do this journey together. He gets 1,500 pounds of supplies, and they depart Juneau on June 6th. So again, I'll throw a date at you again just to keep an eye on how long this is taking. And he decides to keep a journal, which is actually really how we know most of the stuff that happened during this trip. Their first leg is to travel 120 miles to the city of Dyea, which is again a more interior jumping off point. So that boat ride should take 2 hours. It's kind of like crossing the English Channel. It should take 2 hours to get up to Dyea, but the weather is so bad, the boat keeps taking on water. It's a mess. It takes 2 days for them to get there. So when they get to the Chilkoot Trail, they hire 6 Chilkoot guides, so indigenous people from the area, to help carry provisions to the next stop, which is Lake Lindeman. It usually takes 3 to 6 days, but they accomplished it in 23 hours. They basically just did not sleep and kept on going and going. So it was highly recommend. If this sounds interesting, read the book I'm going to tell you about because I don't know how they did it. But at this point, at Lake Lindeman, there's no news of Novak. Knudsen takes a nap and Perrin goes around the lake. Basically, everyone he sees, he shows a picture of Novak. Have you seen him? He might be going under the alias J.A. Smith. No luck. So they head upriver because everyone's like, oh, Lake Lindeman, that's where we find the timber we need to build our boat. Well, no, there's only scrubby trees, so they actually have to head up another side river in order to even get to the timber. And then they have to float it back down the river to Lake Lindeman, prep all of the timber, fashion it into the boat. Obviously, I'm not a carpenter or boat builder, but they have to process it, and it takes a few days, and then 600 miles still to Dawson City, upriver. So the next stop they have all sorts of misadventures. There's rapids. Their boat almost falls apart. At one point, we find out that actually Knudsen brought his dog with him, and that was a rough journey for that bloodhound, but he was helping keep their spirits up. And they get to Lake Bennett. And while they're paddling across Lake Bennett, they see a SCO, so they see another boat, so they wave and say, just exchange pleasantries. This is one of the first really wild moments in this story. Frank Novak was on that boat. Perrin talked to him. They didn't know it was, obviously, he didn't know it was Frank Novak, or else this story would have ended a lot sooner. But in just a really odd coincidence, Frank Novak, his quarry, was on this boat. He said hi to him, and it was because he assumed that with that much lead time, Frank Novak would have gotten farther and was probably in Dawson City already, but not the case. So now, he has no idea, but he's actually ahead of Frank because he and Knudsen are much more efficient at this journey than Frank Novak and his group are. So some days progress would be 30 miles, some days would be 3. The weather is crazy. The mosquitoes drive caribou to madness, so they have to build fires to make sure they aren't driven to madness. They get through some rapids, but they almost smash their boat on the boats of smashed, on other smashed boats that have been stuck in the rapids from people that tried it before and it didn't work out. There's a bunch of fog for a week, so they can't really see where they're going. And no matter who they ask, no one has seen Frank Novak, again, because he's behind them, but they even get to a point where they have a register where there's a Canadian he doesn't work for the government, but he's kind of a land speculator. He's kind of an important person of this area, William Ogilvie, and he has kept a list of everyone that has come through this particular area. He's gotten everyone's name. They look through it. They don't see Frank Novak. They don't see J.A. Smith. They don't see any potential alias, so they have lost that sort of a clue. They're getting tired. They get to the point where they basically have to take turns sleeping or eating. No one's really sleeping. But by July 1st, they arrive in Dawson City. And that's a modern-day picture of Dawson City, so 2007. So obviously not what it looked like when they arrived there, but just to give you an idea of where they are, kind of what it looks like with the river there and the hills. So at this point, it's kind of boomed up to a town of 3,000, but pretty much everyone lives in tents. It's muddy, it's cold, and Perrin immediately begins his search. And, of course, he has to bring in the Mounties. The Northwest Mounted Police have to come in and help. He kind of becomes deputized in a way with them. That's not how they would put it, but he had to kind of pass muster with them and pass some tests in order to be able to kind of be able to operate there in cooperation with them. But they agreed to fully cooperate and help tracking down Frank Novak. And basically, there's nothing he can do besides kind of prowl around town, saying hi to people, showing them the picture, and monitor any boats that are coming in. So he's kind of just sitting there on the shore, just watching people step off boats, seeing if it's Frank Novak or anyone that he recognized. Interestingly enough, a boat lands, and before this, I know it kind of gives it away to have it up there, but a boat lands a few days before this, and on this boat is someone that he worked with before, met at the same time he met that William Ogilvie, so kind of a Canadian government official that he said, hey, have you found that guy yet? And he's like, no, still looking for him. But also on that boat was the wife of J.A. Swift. So Swift was the group leader of the group that Novak was with. So his wife's gotten off this boat, so Perrin goes, oh, well, she might know something about this. So he keeps following her, and she's like, I have no idea where my husband is. He should be here soon. So he has to finally leave her alone. But the Swift finally arrives on the 12th. You know, he's doing his thing. He's watching all the rivals. A guy sits down on the edge of the boat, and it's him. It's Frank Novak. So he walks up to him and says, hey, I've been looking for you, and I've finally found you. And Frank says, what are you talking about? My name is J.A. Smith. I don't know any Frank Novak or Walford, Iowa. Where's that? So he asks him, he says, okay, your name's J.A. Smith. Write that down. He's brought his handwriting sample from Frank Novak, and they match almost identically according to the stories. So he also, at that point, says, well, that's good enough for me, and brings Novak to Constantine, so that the Northwest Mounted Police. And at that point, they say, the Mountie Constantine says, okay, yeah, the handwriting match does look pretty close. And Novak has also brought dental records and descriptions of what his teeth look like. So they have a doctor come, look at the dental records, and the doctor looks at Frank Novak's mouth, or J.A. Smith's mouth, and they say, okay, yeah, that seems like the same person too. But he said, I want to really be sure. And he pulls out a surprise witness that he's found, which was, coincidentally, a man from Cedar Rapids that is in Dawson City who's done business in Walford and happens to belong to the same fraternal lodge that Frank Novak was a part of. So he doesn't tell Frank that this man's coming in. So the man comes in, stops, goes, Frank Novak, I know you. We're in the same lodge together. And at that point, they said Frank Novak did not have a reply to that, which is kind of the second really crazy coincidence that out in this city of 3,000 people, there just happens to be there's Iowa people everywhere you go. It's just proof that this is true. Yep. So at this point now, all the paperwork checks out. They devise a plan to get Novak back to Iowa. So they take him 40 miles downriver, about 40 miles to a fort where he is supervised. Interestingly enough, at that point, Perrin actually goes back to Dawson City where the town throws him a party. He's a hero. He's captured this horrible man. And then he goes back to the fort. And then they have to go on a ship 1,700 miles to the Bering Sea. Novak spends this time in leg shackles. He's monitored 24 hours a day, mainly because they're worried he's either going to escape or kill himself. So they want to make sure that doesn't happen. But they say on this ship, he's really treated, the crew kind of treats him just like another guy that happens to be in leg shackles. They play cards. Again, they're playing cards. They're drinking whiskey, smoking tobacco. And Ogilvy actually comes with them. And Ogilvy is a photographer, so he decides he wants to take a picture of Novak, both with the beard that he has and after they shave the beard off. And part of this is so they can prove that they captured him in case he should die or something should happen for the insurance company, but also because Ogilvy sees that as a student of human nature, this would be interesting. He actually has a picture of Red Perrin and Frank Novak next to each other, and he pulls them out as like a parlor game. Like he'll go to parties and he'll be like, which one do you think is the detective and which one do you think is the murderer? And they said most of the time people would not get it right. They would say that Perrin, as the rough and tumble police detective, looked more like a bad guy than Frank Novak did. So finally Novak says, okay, fine, I'm Frank Novak. Yes, I'm this guy that you've been looking for. But they reach St. Michael, so this is on the Bering. They make it to the port on July 21st, but there are no outbound steamers. So they just kind of have to hang around in this port town for another 15 days. And then a boat comes, but the weather's too bad. The tide's not right. So they have to wait additional time before they can unload that boat, get everyone back on a boat. So it's not until August 16th that they can even leave Alaska. And just in case you have forgotten, they found Novak on July 12th. So it's been an additional month that it's taken them to get out of Alaska and ready to go back to the United States. By the time they get to Washington, and there was a whole nother set of drama. There were Chinese pirates, apparently, that were trying to capture the ship. So the U.S. Coast Guard basically had to come escort them through part of it, which slowed them down. But by the time they get to Washington, Perrin is able to send his first telegraph to say, "We got him, we're on our way." And a very astute or lucky, depending on how you look at it or whose story you're listening to, Associated Press reporter picks up on this telegram. And soon newspapers all over the country have picked up on it. They make it to St. Paul via train on September 1st. And at this point in time, Novak starts getting really worried. He says out loud, okay, so they've all kind of become buddies to a certain extent. He's gotten more comfortable with Perrin. And he says, "I'm pretty nervous I'm going to be met by a mob, and they're just going to hang me." And they say, that's not going to happen. But they do invite a newspaper reporter from the Cedar Rapids Evening Gazette, which is the newspaper that had been covering this story, as much as possible since the fire broke out. They invite a reporter to come onto the train and do an interview with Novak before he gets home that can be published, not so much as a tell your own story, but just kind of to touch base with the story again with readers after basically months of speculation. This is also kind of the area where yellow or sensational journalism is really beginning. So, their headlines are like, 99% of people think Frank Novak is a horrible, guilty murderer who is gonna rob all your stores. So it was just hyperbole and always looking for something really dramatic to do. On the way home to Vinton, they also stop at the city of LaPorte, Iowa, because Frank Novak is now getting very concerned about his legal defense. So there's a pretty well-known attorney for the area named Kate Levasseur that they invite onto the train as a kind of a legal consultant, or he wants to hire him as his lawyer. So Kate Levasseur gets on the train to kind of do a consult with Frank Novak. They arrive in Vinton, Iowa, so that's our county. 2:30 a.m. on September 2nd. Even at that hour, there's 100 people waiting at the station to see him because he's a murderer, to see if it's really him, that he's really actually alive, because his family, especially that Joe Novak, that cousin that was kind of the shady lawyer, has just maintained to this point that my cousin's dead. He died in the store. I'm not going to believe he's alive until I see him alive. Well, that time has now come. And he's taken to the Benton County Jail. So he's back in Iowa, and it's time for justice. So we start to build our teams here. So M.J. Tobin, who is the county attorney who made sure that we heard his name when we talked about the inquest, so he's the one that's going to be responsible for trying the case. And it's his first case in this capacity. He had just started. He was still pretty young. He went by M.J. Tobin because he has a very Irish-sounding name, so he doesn't want to fall prey to any anti-Irish sentiment at this time. So since this case is built largely on circumstantial evidence, there's no one that sees him standing there with some sort of murder weapon. He looks at the fact that it's circumstantial evidence and the fact that he's a relatively young attorney and decides he needs to bring in kind of a bigger gun, a more experienced and respected attorney to be his co-counsel. And he has been, so we have here, this is the name of the attorney he brings on. So it's a family firm from the area. So Bowie's father had started the firm. So Earl Bowie is still in his 20s, but he had about 4 or 5 years of trial experience and had worked with his father very closely, who was very respected. So it was seen to be a pretty good match here. And one thing Tobin had been doing the whole time, he was communicating with the detective. He was really making sure he was holding on to that evidence that he had caused to be saved right after that inquest, and making sure the chain of evidence was really secure, and making sure that he had all the witness statements that he needed, so there would be the least wiggle room to put any doubts about any of it. So as a reminder, so there was the evidence from the body, so those 4 items that had been found in the rubble. There was the dental evidence, so Louis Hassick, the dental assistant, saying there's no way this could be him. The dental work wouldn't fit in his jaw. There's witness identification. So Cato Sells, the lawyer that had come onto the train at LaPorte, said, I'm not going to represent you to Novak. So he had to find another attorney, and he landed on Thomas Milner of Belle Plaine. And he was a pretty colorful character. You know, it's kind of a trope we see in courtroom dramas today where, you know, you've got the dignified, you know, traditional lawyers, but then you've got that zesty, like, young bulldog, like, a lawyer of the people. And he, as it says here, these are from the newspaper. These are not my descriptions. The newspapers called him flamboyant, cocky, eccentric, and he used lots of swear words, and he was not afraid to swear in court. So this was like, he was just a character, and it definitely was going to make an impression. His advice to his clients and his legal philosophy was always deny everything and ask for proof. But he also was still relatively young. He was kind of, maybe not surprisingly, a bit of a hothead, so he also decided to bring on a co-counsel that would maybe balance out his personality. So he adds Judge John Joseph Ney. So he was a retired judge, but again, older, much more kind of dignified, so it would balance out, you know, him just saying, there's that hot-headed crackpot that's here saying crazy things to try to get this guy off the, you know, not accused of murder, not guilty of murder. So we have, next up came the grand jury and the arraignment. So the big deal, everyone had been waiting for the grand jury because from the time they found Novak, he said, I am not telling my story until the grand jury. I'm not telling you anything. I'm not telling you newspaper reporters. I'm not telling my lawyer the full story. Like, I'm waiting for the grand jury. This is where I'm going to say my piece. The grand jury comes. Novak refuses to talk. He doesn't testify. He doesn't tell anyone anything. But then this sneaky story comes out. A witness that didn't appear before, you know, the inquest before, no one's ever heard from before, says, oh, you know, I was in the store last winter, and Novak came in, and it was a pharmacy, and he asked how much morphine you could need to put in whiskey to, like, incapacitate someone. Because he said he wanted to put that in his store, so if a robber came in, because apparently when his store had been robbed, the robbers had always drank his whiskey. He said, I'm poisoning it, so that way the robbers, I can catch them because they will be incapacitated. They'll be unconscious. So then everyone said, wait, is he a murderer, or did this guy who was known to be the town drunk just see this whiskey, drink it, and then he was poisoned. He wasn't smashed on the head with anything. He was poisoned. So it's not known whether this was a leaked story by his defense team to add a shadow of doubt to the proceedings, but it wasn't fake. Like, it was real. They could prove that this had happened. So at this point, actually, Novak is living kind of a good life. He's definitely not in a jail cell with nothing. Like, they gave him books and magazines. The jailer's wife cooked him 3 homemade meals a day. Like, he was eating way better than he had when he was, on the run in Alaska. And he was a ladies' man. Ladies would send him flowers, candy, cakes. So, like, he actually was doing pretty well. He wouldn't talk to anyone. But then he had one visitor come that he did want to talk to, and that was the father of Ed Murray. So at this point, his dad is 86 years old. He says to Novak, I'm not doing well. I don't have a lot of time left. Tell me, did you kill my son? And he says, Novak does want to talk to him, and he says, well, it's definitely your son that passed away, but there are things that I don't understand, and there are things I can't tell you. That's all he said. So this is kind of a big deal because it's the first time he said, yes, Novak said, yes, this is Ed Murray was with me in the store, and it's Ed Murray's body. So that was kind of at least something. But we're still not getting, at this point, the only person that knows the whole story of what happened that day is Frank Novak, and he is not telling anyone. So the grand jury reaches their verdict. So he's indicted on 2 counts. So he's the murder of Edward Murray. So there's lesser charges of arson and conspiracy, but the murder is the big one. And so he's indicted with assaulting Murray with a weapon and beating him with the intent of murder. And Novak pleads not guilty. They specifically said in the newspaper, he put a lot of emphasis on the not guilty as he stood there in the courtroom. Of course, his attorney immediately goes, we want to change a venue. There's no way that people in this area can give us a fair trial. And they end up going back and forth, and Milner agrees to drop the request for a change of venue if they can delay the trial until November, which was when the Benton County District Court would convene. So they've got a few months to figure things out. So then we have another leak to the press in the time leading up to the trial. So apparently, while they were on that boat or the ship going through Alaska, Novak had gotten pretty comfortable with Perrin and had confessed, not the whole thing, but had made a partial confession. He said, Ed Murray drank the poisoned whiskey when I wasn't looking, like I wasn't in the room when it happened, so it came back in and he wasn't making any sense, and then he passed out. So I took him upstairs, put him on a cot, went in my bed, or I sat there and I read a book for a little while, fell asleep, and then I woke up and the store was on fire. So that's the one tidbit we've been able to pull out. So he later repeated this confession to Perrin, but asked Perrin not to tell anyone. And Perrin said, I will not tell anyone until the grand jury. And he wrote the whole thing down in his diary that he'd been keeping, like the whole confession. And then when they got to St. Paul, he told Tobin, the attorney, because that's kind of part of his job. So Novak's lawyers leak this and use it to try to make Perrin look like a liar, or that he was untrustworthy. You told him you would not tell anyone about this confession until the grand jury, but you told at least 2 people, and then your diary was published almost verbatim serialized in newspapers, published by your insurance company to sell copies for entertainment. Doesn't sound like we can trust a word you say, Perrin. Then we get to November, and the trial begins on November 9th. The judge picked for this trial was very straight-laced, so they knew he wasn't going to put up for courtroom shenanigans. So he wasn't probably going to let Milner, do a bunch of crazy stuff for attention to try to make points. So everyone thought pretty much they were going to have to play it straight there. Tobin opens with sharing a timeline of the events, just to remind everyone what's been going on, emphasizes the items that were left at the scene. If there was nothing suspicious going on, why would Frank Novak take out his dental work and put it underneath his head? There's no reason why his bridge work would be under his head unless it was to make us think that was him. The defense downplays and says he doesn't have any motive, he doesn't have anything against Ed Murray. Why would he risk killing this stranger and lose his 2 children, his wife, break up his marriage? He's a pillar of the community. He's just been a victim of bad luck. This fire, his partner falling off of a train. Who would guess that these things would all happen to one person in such a short amount of time? 500 people jam themselves into this courtroom in Benton County every day. Most of them are ladies, again, coming to watch the proceedings. He's still that ladies' man, and they keep sending him gifts. And Tobin really is doubling down on all the physical evidence and really hammering on the financial records. There's something here. There's no reason he would have carried that much insurance if there was no reason for it. So he has Boyce, so not Tobin. So he has his more experienced partner handle Perrin's examination. And Milner spends the whole time just poking at Perrin, trying to discredit him. And that's really all he's got. He doesn't have anything questioning the veracity of Perrin's accounts. He's just really trying to make it seem like he's untrustworthy because he broke that promise about keeping that confession secret until the grand jury. They said that the louder and angrier and more frustrated Milner got, the calmer Perrin got, but by the end of it, they were both pale-faced and shaking because they were just so angry and trying to get at each other, get under each other's skin. And so the judge, did the case for the day, or, ended the day. And the next morning when they started, he basically said, no more. You two need to not have this be personal. I get maybe your personalities clash, but we're keeping this to the facts. And that's the only time they said Perrin ever showed any emotion was that previous. They said the rest of the time he was cool as a cucumber. He had maintained his composure and didn't let Milner ruffle him again. This case on November 15th. So it started November 9th. So the first half basically gets done on the 15th. So the defense calls witnesses that speak to a new theory they have. Gas intoxication. The store was pretty modern. They actually put in a heating system, so they had a gas works, so they were heated by gas. So the new theory they had is there was a leak, there were fumes. Novak didn't know what he was doing. Of course, he couldn't have saved Novak because he was all messed up from the gas fumes, and it was lucky he made it out of the building himself. And then they bring in that whiskey bottle testimony, the poisoned whiskey bottle testimony that has been discovered since the grand jury. Tobin keeps poking holes in this. So Tobin, again representing the state, he proves that two witnesses that are testifying to this poisoned whiskey bottle theory have changed their stories since initially testifying, and proves it, and then threatens, to charge them with perjury. So those are kind of now off the table. So the gas leak story is, no one really is taking that seriously, and this whiskey bottle defense seems to be going downhill as well. And then, after only a couple days with no major witnesses, surprisingly the defense rested. Novak didn't testify. There was a general feeling that they were missing some sort of major witness to help them. And it surprised Tobin and Boyce so much that they actually had to ask for a continuance, because they're just like, what? We have to totally rethink how we're wrapping this up because we expected we'd be making different arguments. So Tobin, for their closings, really emphasized if he is innocent and befuddled by gas fumes, why did he run away to Alaska? That seems like a really extreme reaction to this. He says there's no evidence to support a gas leak, whether for physical evidence from the machinery. No one reported there being any sort of smell or anything like that. And he just kept reinforcing the timeline of events. The defense continued to say he had nothing, there's no reason for him to kill Ed Murray. There's no personal motive. Why would he have done this? And then also again said, he's got 2 children and a wife. Why would he risk his family to have, when he could run away to Alaska? So it was pretty funny. Then, after the case settles, there was an astonishing revelation, and a gentleman in Seattle named Charles Woods comes forth to the police and then the newspaper and says, I saw Ed Murray at the end of February. I told him about it, but no one up with me. But yeah, I totally saw him. He was alive at the end of February. The defense, it should be noted, has done everything they can think of to try to get a mistrial declared. So of course now, if it's possible that someone saw Ed Murray alive a few weeks after he was supposed to have died in a fire, that's definitely grounds for things needing to be re-examined. But Woods family came out and said, well, sorry. Charles Woods tends to drink a lot and imagine things. This is not true. So luckily for our trial, a mistrial was not declared. They got it all sorted out before a mistrial was declared, but it really shook things up for a while there that they thought they would have to be contending with a potential reappearance of this gentleman, of Ed Murray, that, they all had pretty much decided was deceased. They could also not prove that the defense set this up. So they looked for it. It was on everyone's mind. People felt it would not be out of character for Thomas Milner to set up someone to cause this, but they could not prove that it was anything other than just a confused person giving a mistaken account. Jurors returned with a verdict November 23rd after 13 hours of deliberation. Guilty of murder in the second degree, they recommend a sentence of 10 years hard labor. A little bit about the public reaction. So this was one of the first times, not the first, but it was truly one of the first times that someone had been charged with, or convicted, is the word I'm looking for, of murder, just based on circumstantial evidence. So people were really paying attention to this. It was covered across the country, though many newspapers got a few facts wrong. The New York Times said that the two had been roommates and that their house had burned down instead of them being casual acquaintances, and the store had burned down. But there was interest in this case all around the country, so it wasn't just covered locally. There was generally public shock. Again, you have to take it with a grain of salt because of the hyperbole, but one reporter said 99% of the public is outraged that it's not a first-degree conviction and that the death penalty is off the table. A lot of people thought that this should have been a capital punishment. So, of course, Milner and Ney file for an appeal on November 30th, and they include 13 objections as to why they think that they need a new trial. And that increases to 52 objections by the time they get to the sentencing hearing with the judge. Ney also has criticized media coverage for being slanted heavily against Novak, especially that Cedar Rapids Gazette. So Judge Burnham looks at all of this and says, no, the newspaper articles didn't say anything that wasn't true. I didn't pay attention to any of it. It didn't sway me that, my jurors weren't supposed to look at it. So he also overrides the jury's recommended sentence, and his sentences him to life in prison. So Judge Burnham really felt that it was a serious offense and that 10 years hard labor was not anywhere near serious enough. In fact, there were some people, including Tobin, who assumed that someone on the jury had been bribed to return a lower sentencing recommendation, or a lower sentence or a lower recommendation than first degree or that capital punishment. So he sets bail at $37,500 after some back and forth between the two sides. And however, the Iowa Supreme Court issues a writ of habeas corpus. So we have him returned to the Benton County Jail instead of headed off to the Anamosa State Penitentiary pending the appeal. They lower his bail to $18,000. Milner takes the train into Des Moines and does some heavy in-person discussion. So it's lowered to $18,000. And everyone said, oh, that's much less than $37,500. We should be able to, scrape that up and figure that out. However, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on whose side you're on, they could only raise $16,000. So they were $2,000 short. So he was not able to post bail. The habeas corpus becomes null. So at the end of December 1897, he is on his way to Anamosa State Penitentiary for his life sentence at hard labor. The appeal ends up being lost in 1898. And for those of you that are unfamiliar, this is a postcard with an image of Anamosa State Penitentiary. This is from 1911, so it's a decade or so after Novak would have started his sentence, but that kind of gives you an idea of where Novak is headed. So that covers our law and order portion, but it doesn't seem somehow like the end of the story. So I did want to make sure to give you a little summary of what was going on after sentencing. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Novak's wife files for divorce in 1904. So not right away, she gave it a few years, but she does file for divorce and it is granted. Unfortunately, his older son, there's two boys, at this point they're 14 and 12, his older son goes missing and is actually never found. So they never find him. So Mrs. Novak ended up dealing with a lot of unfortunate tragedies in her life. Novak, perhaps unsurprisingly, becomes a model prisoner, whether for real or just to, as a means to an end. He organized the prison band and orchestra, and he organized a prison library as well. So he's there as part of what they would consider the rehabilitation, really building up the arts side of things. He also becomes a very good photographer, and for some reason, when the governor of Iowa comes to Anamosa in 1907, he ends up taking a photograph of the governor that's just so good that it kind of creates this relationship between Governor Cummins, who was, and Frank Novak. So he ends up commuting the life sentence 25 years. And also I should add Milner, so his attorney is still hitting the ground quite a bit. And he lucks out by having an editor of the Cedar Rapids Gazette believes he's innocent. So there ends up kind of being a turn in the media too. So he ends up getting some, people don't give up on him, his people support him. And so he gets time off for good behavior. So he's actually released in September of 1911. At this point, he is transferred from Anamosa to Fort Madison, a state penitentiary. So he actually walks out of Fort Madison a free man instead of Anamosa. But apart from a scuffle with the warden of Fort Madison, who apparently he decided he did not like, that almost landed him back in Fort Madison, he made his way out of town, remarried a young lady, and who was billed as being a sweetheart from his youth that no one had ever heard of before. They end up moving to Chicago. He becomes a real estate broker, and the rest of his life is quiet and uneventful, at least as far as news outlets are concerned. So he dies in 1930. When he initially dies, no one claims his body. His parents and his family back in Iowa are still kind of horrified by this whole thing, but eventually they come pick up the body, and he's buried in Cedar Rapids next to his parents. So it was a very full few years there, and then he managed to at least keep things on the straight and narrow enough that it didn't get reported in the newspaper. So, for more information, like I said, I really recommend the book Skull in the Ashes by Peter Kaufman. It was published by University of Iowa Press in 2013. I actually didn't know about this book until after I had learned about the story altogether, but it's a really great definitive guide to this. It brings in a lot of information about, contextual information. So you're going to learn a little bit more about the gold rush. You're going to learn a little bit more about court cases at the time. And there's a lot of good pictures in it too. So if you want more information about what Alaska would look like, what the people in the story look like, it's got a lot of great images in it as well. So, and that's the story of Frank Novak and arson and murder in Walford. So thank you very much.
I love it. What a roller coaster.
I know.
That's very cool. Just We're going to go ahead and shut this down, but if anybody has any questions after, please feel free. Next February, as part of Black History Month, we will have historical researcher and fiber artist Kina Clemens. She will be leading all of you into a journey of quilting and how it fits into African ancestral heritage. This ties in with the controversial theory of quilts being used as part of the Underground Railroad. And she is bringing fabric here so you can construct your own quilt block. So it's going to be a really hands-on, great opportunity to learn more about this part of history as part of Black History Month. So again, as always, thank you to the West Des Moines Library and EMC Insurance and our donors and members. Without you, this wouldn't be possible. Thanks so much.
So how old was he when he died?